The dismissive avoidance pattern of maintaining multiple connections simultaneously, whether through actual dating, keeping exes accessible, cultivating ambiguous relationships, or simply ensuring they always have options beyond their primary partner, isn't about promiscuity or commitment issues in the way most people understand those terms. It's a sophisticated defense mechanism that serves their core psychological need to avoid dependency on any single person, to maintain the illusion that no one person is essential, to ensure that they never become vulnerable to the kind of loss that would devastate them. The dismissive avoidant doesn't necessarily want multiple partners in the sense of actively desiring multiple romantic or sexual relationships. They need multiple partners as psychological insurance against the terror of needing someone too much, as proof that they're not dependent, as escape routes that prevent any single relationship from becoming so important that losing it would be intolerable. This pattern is often hidden, rationalized as keeping friendships with exes, maintaining an active social life, or simply being someone who values their independence and connections with many people. But beneath these justifications lies a strategic distribution of attachment that ensures the avoidant never puts all their emotional eggs in one basket, never allows one person to become so central that their absence would create a void the avoidant couldn't manage. Understanding why dismissive avoidants need this structure reveals the profound fear driving their behavior and the emptiness this strategy ultimately creates despite its effectiveness at protecting them from the vulnerability of genuine, focused attachment to one person. The illusion of independence through distributed attachment. The dismissive avoidant maintains multiple connections as a way of creating and preserving the illusion of independence, convincing themselves and others that they don't need any particular person because they have many people, that they're self-sufficient because their emotional needs are distributed across multiple sources rather than concentrated in one relationship. This distribution feels like independence to the avoidant. They're not dependent on any single person, not vulnerable to any one loss, not trapped in the kind of focused attachment that would give another person power over their emotional well-being. But this isn't genuine independence. It's dependence disguised as independence. Attachment spread so thin across multiple connections that it remains manageable and controllable. The illusion works because the dismissive avoidant can point to their multiple connections as evidence that they're not needy, not clingy, not the kind of person who loses themselves in relationship. They have friends, they have ex-partners they remain in contact with, they have people they're casually dating or keeping as options. To outside observers and to themselves, this looks like someone who's socially engaged, who values many connections, who doesn't put unrealistic expectations on any single relationship to meet all their needs. This framing makes the pattern seem healthy, diversified attachment, not putting all eggs in one basket, maintaining rich social networks beyond romantic partnership. But the illusion crumbles when examined closely. The dismissive avoidant isn't distributing attachment because they have such abundant capacity for connection that it overflows one relationship. They're distributing attachment because focused attachment terrifies them, because putting significant emotional weight on any single person triggers their fear of dependency, because they need the psychological safety of knowing that no one person matters enough that losing them would be devastating. The multiple connections aren't about having so much love to give. They're about ensuring that no one person receives enough of their attachment that the avoidant becomes vulnerable to loss. The distributed attachment also serves to maintain emotional distance in each individual relationship. When the dismissive avoidant has multiple connections, they can justify limited availability and investment in each one. They can't be fully present with their primary partner because they have other relationships and commitments. They can't invest deeply in any friendship because they have multiple friends they're maintaining. They can't focus entirely on one person because that would mean neglecting others. This distribution creates built-in justification for the distance the avoidant craves, making their unavailability seem like a consequence of being busy and socially engaged, rather than a defensive strategy to avoid intimacy. The illusion of independence through distributed attachment allows the dismissive avoidant to avoid the sustained vulnerability that focused attachment requires. When all your emotional needs are met primarily by one person, that person sees you fully. Your needs, your vulnerabilities, your moments of weakness, your dependence on them for support and connection. This level of being known feels dangerous to the dismissive avoidant. But when attachment is distributed, no single person sees the full picture of the avoidant's emotional landscape. Each person receives a curated, managed version of the avoidant that never reveals complete dependence or vulnerability. The avoidant remains protected because they've never shown anyone their full self, never allowed anyone to see how much they actually need connection. The distributed attachment also protects the dismissive avoidant from having to do the deep work that focused partnership requires. Maintaining one primary relationship demands addressing conflicts, working through difficulties, developing intimacy over time, building the kind of trust that only comes through sustained presence and vulnerability. But maintaining multiple surface-level connections allows the avoidant to avoid this depth. When difficulty arises in one connection, they can redirect attention to another. When vulnerability is required in one relationship, they can retreat to others where they remain more defended. The multiple connections allow them to experience relationship without doing the work that genuine intimacy demands. The illusion of independence also serves the dismissive avoidance need to maintain optionality and avoid feeling trapped. Having multiple connections means they always have somewhere else to direct their attention if any single relationship becomes too demanding, too intimate, too expectant of consistency and commitment. They're never fully committed anywhere because they're partially committed everywhere, and this prevents the claustrophobia. The avoidant experiences when they feel locked into focused partnership with one person who expects and deserves their full presence and investment. The distributed attachment creates a life that looks full. Many people, many connections, much activity, but feels empty because none of the connections reach the depth that actually satisfies human needs for intimacy and being truly known. The dismissive avoidant has many people but no one, many connections but no real intimacy, many options but no genuine partnership. They've protected themselves so effectively from dependency that they've also protected themselves from the very connection they need, creating an illusion of independence that's actually a sophisticated form of emotional isolation, where they remain alone even while surrounded by people who think they're connected to them. How multiple options protect against the terror of dependency. The dismissive avoidance need for multiple partners functions primarily as protection against the terror of becoming dependent on any single person, against the vulnerability of needing someone so much that losing them would be intolerable, against the risk of putting themselves in a position where another person has the power to devastate them through departure or rejection. This terror of dependency is the core wound driving dismissive, avoidant attachment, rooted in early experiences where depending on caregivers led to disappointment, neglect, or pain. Maintaining multiple options is the adult avoidant's primary strategy for ensuring they never experience that kind of devastating dependency again. The protection works through psychological dilution of attachment. When the dismissive avoidant distributes their attachment across multiple people, no single person becomes essential enough that losing them would be unbearable. If one person leaves, there are others. If one relationship ends, there are more connections to occupy attention and prevent the avoidant from fully feeling the loss. This structure creates emotional insurance. The avoidant is never putting themselves in a position where one person's absence creates a void they can't manage or a pain they can't tolerate. The multiple options ensure that no single loss is catastrophic because there's always somewhere else to direct attachment. Having multiple options also protects the dismissive avoidant from the anxiety that focused attachment creates. When you're deeply attached to one person, their availability or unavailability significantly impacts your emotional state. When they withdraw, you feel it acutely. When they're present, you feel relief and connection. This fluctuation based on one person's behavior feels dangerous to the dismissive avoidant because it means their emotional well-being depends on someone else's choices. But when attachment is distributed across multiple people, the impact of any one person's availability is diminished. If one person is distant, the avoidant can focus on others. If one relationship is experiencing difficulty, other relationships provide distraction and alternative sources of connection. The multiple options serve as escape routes that prevent the dismissive avoidant from feeling trapped in any single relationship. Feeling trapped is one of the avoidant's core fears. The sense that they're locked into something they can't leave, that they've committed to someone in ways that limit their freedom, that they're expected to show up consistently, even when doing so feels uncomfortable. Having other options means the avoidant never fully commits anywhere because they always have alternatives. If their primary relationship starts feeling too demanding or too intimate, they know they can redirect attention elsewhere. This knowledge that escape is always available makes each individual relationship feel more tolerable because the avoidant never feels fully committed to any of them. The protection against dependency also operates through the dismissive avoidance ability to maintain emotional distance by comparing connections. When you have only one intimate relationship, you're fully present to its particular dynamics, its specific challenges, its unique qualities. But when you have multiple connections, you can maintain distance from each by comparing them to others. This person is more understanding, but that person is more exciting. Or, this relationship is more stable, but that one is more passionate. This comparison prevents full appreciation of any single connection's value because the avoidant is always measuring each against others, rather than experiencing any relationship on its own terms. The comparison serves to minimize the importance of each individual connection, which protects against dependency. Having multiple options also protects the dismissive avoidant from the vulnerability of pursuit and the potential for rejection. When you're focused on one person, expressing interest, pursuing connection, and investing emotionally, all create significant vulnerability. The other person might not reciprocate, might reject your advances, might not value what you're offering. But when the dismissive avoidant has multiple options, they don't have to pursue any single person with intensity that would create this vulnerability. They can maintain casual connection with multiple people without revealing how much any of them actually matters, without putting themselves in a position where clear rejection from one person would be devastating, because there are always others who provide the illusion that the avoidant is wanted and valued. The multiple options create a buffer against the abandonment the dismissive avoidant fears. If you're attached to one person and they leave, you experience direct abandonment that confirms your worst fears about depending on people. But if you maintain multiple connections and one person leaves, the impact is cushioned by other relationships that remain. The avoidant can tell themselves the loss doesn't matter that much, that they have other people, that they're fine because they weren't that invested anyway. This narrative protection against experiencing abandonment as catastrophic requires maintaining options so that no single departure represents complete loss. The protection through multiple options also allows the dismissive avoidant to avoid confronting their own capacity for sustained intimacy. If they focused on building deep connection with one person, they'd quickly encounter the limits of their own ability to maintain presence, vulnerability, and consistency. They'd have to face that their patterns create problems, that their withdrawal damages intimacy, that their defensive strategies prevent the depth they might actually want. But when connection is distributed across multiple shallow relationships, these limitations never become as apparent. The avoidant can believe they're capable of intimacy because they have many connections, without having to confront that none of those connections reach genuine depth because they can't tolerate the vulnerability depth requires. The terror of dependency that drives the need for multiple options ultimately keeps the dismissive avoidant in a position where they're protected from the pain of loss, but also protected from the joy of genuine connection, where they've insured themselves against devastation, but also against deep satisfaction, where they've maintained control and autonomy, but sacrificed the very intimacy that makes life feel meaningful. The protection works. The dismissive avoidant successfully avoids becoming devastatingly dependent on any single person. But the cost of this protection is that they also never experience the kind of focused, deep, mutual attachment that transforms lives, that provides the security they're seeking through independence, that offers genuine fulfillment rather than the hollow simulation of connection that multiple shallow relationships provide. The emotional safety of never being fully invested anywhere. The dismissive avoidance pattern of maintaining multiple partners creates a psychological state where they're never fully invested in any single relationship, never placing their complete emotional weight on one connection, never committing themselves so thoroughly that retreat would be difficult or costly. This lack of full investment feels like safety to the avoidant. They're protected from being hurt too deeply, from becoming too vulnerable, from experiencing the kind of devastating loss that comes when something you're fully invested in ends. But this safety comes at the profound cost of never experiencing the depth, satisfaction, and transformative power that full investment in relationship provides, leaving the avoidant in a permanent state of emotional hedging that prevents both catastrophic pain and genuine fulfillment. The emotional safety of partial investment manifests first in the dismissive avoidance ability to maintain psychological distance even while appearing to be in relationship. They're present, but not fully present, engaged, but not completely engaged, committed, but with significant reservations and escape routes clearly mapped. This distance means they can participate in relationship without the vulnerability of being all in, without the exposure that comes from showing someone your complete self, without the risk of discovering that what you're offering isn't enough or isn't wanted. The partial investment allows the avoidant to experience relationship while maintaining protective barriers that full investment would require them to dismantle. Never being fully invested also protects the dismissive avoidant from the pain of unmet expectations. When you're fully invested in a relationship, you have hopes and expectations about what that relationship will provide: emotional support, consistent presence, mutual growth, shared future. When those expectations aren't met, the disappointment is acute. But the dismissive avoidant doesn't allow themselves to develop these expectations because they're not fully invested enough to hope for that much. They maintain low expectations across all their connections, which protects them from disappointment, but also ensures they never experience the satisfaction of expectations being met and exceeded by someone who shows up fully for them. The emotional safety of never being fully invested anywhere also allows the dismissive avoidant to avoid the identity implications of deep commitment. When you're fully invested in a relationship, that relationship becomes part of your identity. You're someone's partner. You're building a life with someone. Your choices are made in context of shared existence. This integration of relationship into identity feels threatening to the dismissive avoidant because it suggests loss of self, becoming defined by relationship rather than by independence. But maintaining multiple partial investments means the avoidance identity remains separate from any relationship. They're fundamentally independent, with various connections rather than fundamentally partnered with auxiliary independence. And this identity protection feels crucial to their sense of self. Never being fully invested protects the dismissive avoidant from grief when relationships end. When you've invested everything in a relationship and it ends, the grief is overwhelming. You've lost not just the person, but the future you imagined, the identity you'd built, the home you'd created together. But when the dismissive avoidant maintains only partial investment, endings are more manageable. They can tell themselves it wasn't that serious, they weren't that attached, they have other connections to focus on. This protection from overwhelming grief comes at the cost of never experiencing the joy and depth that make grief so painful when lost. The avoidant has protected themselves from feeling too much pain by ensuring they never feel too much joy or connection either. The emotional safety also includes protection from the vulnerability of being truly known. Full investment in a relationship requires revealing yourself completely, your fears, your wounds, your needs, your limitations, your history, your dreams. This level of exposure is terrifying for the dismissive avoidant because it means someone could see them fully and find them lacking, could know them completely, and choose to leave anyway. But partial investment across multiple connections means the avoidant never reveals their complete self to anyone. Each person sees a curated version, a managed presentation that never exposes the full vulnerability of who the avoidant is beneath their defenses. This protection from being fully known feels safe, but creates profound loneliness because the avoidant is never truly seen by anyone. Never being fully invested anywhere also protects the dismissive avoidant from having to do the sustained work that deep partnership requires. Fully invested relationships demand consistent effort, working through conflicts, addressing patterns, growing together, building shared life, maintaining connection through difficulty and boredom, and changing circumstances. This ongoing work is exactly what the dismissive avoidant wants to avoid. By maintaining multiple partial investments, they can experience the benefits of connection without committing to the sustained labor that depth requires. When one connection becomes demanding of effort, they can redirect to others that feel easier in the moment. The avoidant is essentially relationship hopping internally, even while maintaining multiple connections simultaneously, always moving toward whatever requires least effort and avoiding anything that would demand sustained presence. The emotional safety of partial investment also allows the dismissive avoidant to maintain the fantasy that they could fully invest if they wanted to, that they're capable of depth, but simply haven't found the right person or the right circumstance. This fantasy is protected by never actually testing it. Never being fully invested means never discovering whether they're actually capable of sustaining that investment. The avoidant can tell themselves that their patterns aren't limitations but choices, that they could be different if they decided to be, without having to confront whether that's actually true. The partial investment across multiple connections preserves the possibility of capability without requiring its demonstration. The protection of never being fully invested anywhere ultimately creates a life structure where the dismissive avoidant is emotionally spread so thin that they experience connection without depth, relationship without intimacy, attachment without vulnerability. They're safe from devastating loss because they've ensured nothing is important enough to devastate them. They're protected from overwhelming grief because they've prevented themselves from experiencing the kind of joy and connection that would make grief overwhelming if lost. They're secure from rejection because they've never revealed enough of themselves that rejection would feel truly personal. But this safety is also a prison that prevents the very experiences that make life feel meaningful. Being fully known and fully loved anyway, investing completely in something that matters profoundly, building depth with another person that transforms both of you, experiencing the kind of partnership where two people's lives become genuinely intertwined rather than remaining adjacent. The dismissive avoidant has achieved emotional safety through never being fully invested anywhere, but in doing so has also ensured they never experience the profound satisfaction and meaning that full investment, with all its risks, provides. Why one person's consistency triggers their escape mechanisms. The dismissive avoidance need for multiple partners becomes especially apparent when one person begins showing up consistently, reliably, with genuine care and sustained presence. This consistency, which would feel like safety and security to someone with secure attachment, triggers the avoidance escape mechanisms and intensifies their need for other options. Understanding why consistency is threatening rather than reassuring reveals the core fear driving the avoidance pattern and illuminates why the very thing partners hope will make the avoidant feel safe enough to commit actually pushes them toward maintaining or increasing their investment in alternative connections. Consistency triggers escape mechanisms because it makes one person increasingly important, increasingly central, increasingly difficult to lose without significant impact. When someone shows up reliably day after day, when they demonstrate through sustained action that they're invested in the relationship, when they prove they're not going away despite the avoidance patterns, that person gradually becomes woven into the avoidance life in ways that create dependency. The avoidant begins to rely on their presence, to anticipate their availability, to organize aspects of their life around this person's consistency. This growing importance is exactly what terrifies the dismissive avoidant, because it means losing this person would hurt significantly, would create a void that other connections couldn't immediately fill. The consistent person's presence also highlights the avoidant's own inconsistency and creates implicit pressure for reciprocation. When someone shows up reliably, there's an unspoken expectation that you'll show up reliably too, that you'll match their investment and consistency with your own. This expectation feels like pressure to the dismissive avoidant, even when it's never explicitly stated. The consistent presence itself becomes a kind of demand, not a verbal demand, but a relational one that makes the avoidance withdrawal and inconsistency more visible and less acceptable. The avoidant experiences this implicit pressure as threat to their autonomy, as requirement to perform a level of presence they're not certain they can sustain. Consistency from one person also threatens the avoidance narrative about relationships being inherently unreliable, about people inevitably disappointing, about dependency leading to pain. The dismissive avoidant has constructed these narratives to justify their defensive strategies, to make their patterns seem like wise responses to realistic assessment of relationship dynamics, rather than wounds that need healing. But when someone shows up consistently, when they prove reliable and trustworthy through sustained action, these narratives are challenged. The avoidant must either revise their understanding of relationships or maintain their narratives by finding fault with the consistent person, by creating distance that prevents the consistency from fully registering, by keeping other options available that allow them to minimize the importance of this one person's reliability. The consistent person's sustained presence also makes it harder for the dismissive avoidant to maintain emotional distance through the strategies that usually work, minimizing the relationship's importance, focusing on flaws, keeping interaction superficial. Consistency breaks through these defenses because it's hard to minimize someone who keeps showing up. Difficult to focus only on flaws when someone consistently demonstrates care. Impossible to keep things superficial when someone's sustained presence creates opportunities for depth. The avoidant feels their defenses weakening in the face of this consistency, and this weakening triggers panic about losing control over intimacy levels and becoming more vulnerable than they can tolerate. Consistency from one person intensifies the dismissive avoidance fear of engulfment and loss of self. When someone is consistently present, there's a natural pull toward integration of lives, toward spending more time together, toward building shared routines and future plans. This integration feels like loss of autonomy to the avoidant, like their independent identity being gradually subsumed into couple identity, like their freedom being restricted by another person's consistent presence and the obligations that creates. The more consistent the person is, the more the avoidant feels pulled toward this kind of integration, and the more desperately they need other connections to assert their independence and prove they're not becoming consumed by one relationship. The consistent person's reliability also triggers the dismissive avoidance fear that they'll become complacent and take this person for granted until they leave, or that they'll hurt this person through their patterns in ways they'll regret. The avoidant recognizes on some level that consistency is rare and valuable, that someone showing up reliably despite their patterns is offering something precious. But this recognition creates anxiety about their own capacity to reciprocate, about whether they'll damage something good through their inability to show up consistently themselves. This anxiety about inevitable failure can trigger the avoidant to preemptively create distance or maintain other options as a way of protecting themselves from the guilt and pain of eventually disappointing someone who's been consistently good to them. Consistency from one person also makes the dismissive avoidant more aware of what they're avoiding by maintaining multiple connections. When someone is consistently present, it becomes harder to ignore that the other connections lack that depth and reliability, that the multiple options the avoidant maintains are actually lesser substitutes for what this one person is offering. This awareness creates cognitive dissonance. The avoidant has to acknowledge they're choosing multiple shallow connections over one deep one, that their pattern isn't about valuing many connections, but about avoiding committing fully to any connection. This recognition threatens the narrative that maintains the avoidant's self-image as someone independent rather than someone defended. The escape mechanisms triggered by consistency include the avoidant intensifying contact with alternative connections, suddenly becoming more invested in casual relationships or friendships that had been peripheral, reaching out to exes or past connections, or beginning new casual dating even while in committed relationship. These behaviors serve to dilute the importance of the consistent person, to prove to themselves that they're not dependent on anyone, to create psychological distance from the intimacy the consistent presence is generating. The avoidant might also create literal distance by traveling, by becoming busier with work, by filling their schedule with activities that limit time with the person who's showing up consistently. Why one person's consistency triggers escape mechanisms ultimately reveals that the dismissive avoidant isn't seeking safety through reliable connection. They're seeking safety through ensuring no connection becomes too reliable, too important, too difficult to lose. Consistency threatens the avoidance protective structure by making one person matter too much, by creating the very dependency the avoidant has organized their life to avoid, by challenging the narratives that justify their patterns, by pulling them toward the intimacy and integration that represent their deepest fears. The need for multiple partners intensifies precisely when one person shows up consistently because that consistency is working. It's creating attachment, building trust, generating intimacy. And the avoidant responds to this success not by reciprocating, but by reinforcing their defenses through maintaining and intensifying alternative connections that prevent any single relationship from achieving the depth and importance that genuine partnership requires.